The room was silent when Sandra walked in. It was not just silence. It was the kind that makes every heartbeat sound louder, the kind that holds unspoken memories in the air. The old wooden floor creaked beneath her steps as she entered the studio where years ago laughter once echoed. The smell of paint and dust mixed with faint perfume from old rehearsals. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. People turned slowly, some pretending to be busy with scripts, others unable to hide their surprise. No one expected her return. Not after what had happened years ago. Not after the day she had walked out, leaving behind unfinished scenes, broken trust, and questions that were never answered. And then there was him. Keanu stood near the piano, a quiet figure in a black jacket, looking at the light coming through the high window. He did not move when she entered, not at first. His face was calm, unreadable, almost as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. Sandra froze, her breath caught. She had imagined this moment countless times, how she would walk back in, how people would react, what she might say. But now that it was real, her throat tightened. Words felt heavy. The director whispered something to the assistant, breaking the silence, but even that felt distant. It was Keanu who finally moved. Slowly he turned his head and their eyes met. For a moment everything stopped. The years, the distance, the rumors, none of it mattered. There was only that look, calm, knowing, gentle, and then he spoke just one word, her name. Sandra. It wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. It was not just a greeting. It was a memory, a question, and an answer all in one. The room seemed to exhale after he said it. She felt something stir deep inside her chest. Fear, guilt, warmth, she couldn't tell which. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. She nodded slightly, unsure if her voice would come out steady. Hi, Keanu's lips curved into the faintest smile. It's been a while. That simple line broke the invisible wall. She looked around. Some faces she recognized, others were new. The new crew didn't know the story. The old ones avoided her gaze. The director, a man named Martin who had taken over the new project, stepped forward and said softly, "Sandra, we're so happy you're here." But his eyes flicked toward Keanu, as if asking permission to continue. Keanu gave a small nod. "Let's start fresh," he said. It sounded like something he had practiced in his mind, but his tone made it real. Sandra walked toward the corner where her old script lay on the table. She picked it up and saw her handwriting on the first page. A scene description. A love confession. Something she had never finished filming. She remembered that last day. The set had been chaotic, lights had fallen, someone had screamed, and before the chaos settled, she was gone. They had said she left without explanation. Some called her unprofessional. Others said she had a breakdown. No one knew the truth. Only Keanu did. He had seen what she did that day. How she pushed a young crew member away seconds before the light rig collapsed. How she stayed back to make sure everyone got out safely. But when the producers demanded an explanation, she stayed silent. She took the blame. She couldn't tell them why she was there when she wasn't supposed to be. Now, standing here again, she could feel those moments replaying like an old film reel behind her eyes. "Ready?" Martin asked. She looked up. "Yes." They began rehearsing. The first scene required her and Keanu to act as if meeting after years. How strange, she thought, that fiction and reality had merged so completely. As the cameras rolled, she stepped toward him just like before. His eyes met hers with calm intensity. "You left," he said in character. Her line was written as "I had to." But her voice trembled slightly as she said it. It was no longer acting. It was truth. "Did you ever think about coming back?" he asked, sticking to the script. She was supposed to say sometimes. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Every day." The room went quiet again. Even Martin didn't call cut. The emotion in her voice was too real to interrupt. Keanu's expression softened. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Then why didn't you?" A tear threatened to fall, but she held it back. "Because I didn't think anyone wanted me to?" Keanu looked at her for a long time before replying. "You were wrong." The silence stretched again. It wasn't acting anymore. The crew could feel it. The air had changed. This wasn't a script being read. It was a story healing itself. When Martin finally called cut, no one clapped. Everyone just stood still, absorbing what they had witnessed. Sandra wiped her eyes and turned away quickly. She didn't want anyone to see her cry. She walked to the corner and sat down, pretending to fix her makeup. But her hands were shaking. Then quietly she felt a shadow fall beside her. Keanu sat down next to her without saying a word. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer sympathy. He just sat there, presence calm, eyes gentle, as if he knew silence could heal more than words. After a few moments, he spoke softly. "You were brave that day." She froze. "What do you mean?" "The light rig," he said. "I saw what happened." Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected him to mention it. "You remember?" "I never forgot." Sandra looked away. "No one believed me." "I did," he said simply. She looked at him then, his calm face framed by soft light from the window. There was no judgment there, only understanding. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Keanu stood up slowly. "Take your time," he said. "The next scene can wait." She nodded. Her eyes followed him as he walked away to talk to Martin. She saw how people respected him. Not for his fame, but for his calmness, his quiet leadership, the way he treated everyone equally. She realized something then. People like him didn't need to shout to be heard. They didn't need to prove kindness. They just lived it. And in that silent room where so many things had once gone wrong, Sandra felt something shift. Not everything was fixed, but something had started to heal. As she looked again at the piano in the corner, she noticed a small folded paper resting on it. Maybe someone had left notes from the last shoot, or maybe it was something else. She hesitated, then walked over. Her name was written on the paper, just one word, Sandra. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a single line written in careful handwriting. "Some truths stay silent until kindness gives them a voice." She turned around, but Keanu was already across the room, quietly adjusting a camera light with the crew, pretending not to notice her reading it. And in that moment, she understood. The whisper of her name wasn't just recognition, it was forgiveness, it was kindness, it was the start of something she thought she had lost forever. The next morning began with soft sunlight spilling through the large studio windows. The air smelled of coffee, fresh paint, and faint dust from the stage floor. The new film's schedule was pinned on the wall, but all eyes were on one corner of the room, the space where Keanu and Sandra would rehearse again. The memory of yesterday still lingered in everyone's mind. The quiet intensity between them had left the whole crew stunned. Sandra arrived early, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied back, her face calm but her eyes restless. She had barely slept. The note from the piano kept replaying in her mind. She wondered who wrote it, though deep inside she already knew. Keanu was already there, as always, sitting quietly by the piano, tuning the same few notes. His calm presence filled the room before any words did. He looked up when she entered, gave a small nod, then returned to his task. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied. They didn't say more. But the silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was warm, almost comforting. As the rest of the crew began setting up lights and props, Sandra looked at the script again. Today's scene was about two people confronting their past. It was supposed to be fiction, but life had already blurred the line. Martin walked in with his clipboard and an encouraging smile. "We'll shoot the confrontation today," he said. "I know it's emotional, but just follow the rhythm we discussed." Keanu nodded. Sandra simply said, "Okay." The set was ready. Cameras rolled. The lights dimmed to a soft glow that mimicked evening light. Keanu stood by the window, playing the scene's role of a man who never stopped caring, waiting for a chance to speak the truth. Sandra entered slowly, eyes filled with doubt. Her first line trembled on her lips. "I don't know if I can do this." Keanu's reply came naturally. "You already are." Her voice cracked as she looked at him. "You forgave me so easily. Why?" "Because you didn't do anything wrong." The line wasn't in the script. Martin noticed, but he didn't stop the scene. The emotion was too real. Sandra blinked, trying to stay in character, but her voice broke completely. "Everyone thought I left because I was afraid. No one knew what really happened." Keanu's eyes softened. "Maybe it's time they did." And then she said it, the truth she had carried for years. "I stayed behind to help a boy who was stuck. I didn't even realize the light was falling. I thought I could fix it." The room went still. Not a single sound came from behind the cameras. Keanu took a step closer, his face unreadable. "You did fix it," he said quietly. "You saved him." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. The scene ended with no official cut. Martin just lowered his hand and whispered, "Beautiful." As the lights dimmed again, Sandra walked off the stage and sat down, covering her face for a moment. She wasn't crying out of sadness, it was release. Keanu approached quietly and placed a cup of water beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, still catching her breath. "I didn't plan to say all that." "You didn't have to plan it," he said. "Truth doesn't need permission." She looked at him, studying his calm face. "How did you know?" "I was there," he said simply. "I saw it all. I should have spoken up, but I didn't, and I've regretted it ever since." Sandra frowned slightly. "You tried, didn't you?" He sighed, his voice low. "They wouldn't have listened then. They needed someone to blame, and you let them." She looked down. "I thought it would be easier that way." "Easier for who?" he asked softly. For everyone, she whispered. The crew, the studio, the press, I just wanted it to end. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his tone still gentle. Sometimes silence looks like peace, but it's just pain that learned to hide. His words struck her deeply. She didn't answer, she couldn't. For a long time, they just sat in quiet understanding. There were no apologies, only truth finally shared after years of distance. Martin came over after a few minutes. You both were incredible, he said sincerely. That scene, it wasn't acting, it was real emotion. I've never seen anything like it. Keanu smiled faintly. That's because it was real. The crew slowly began to reset for the next scene, but the energy in the room had changed. People moved more gently, as if aware they were witnessing something rare, two people healing through art. Later that evening, as everyone packed up, Sandra lingered by the window. Outside, the sky was turning golden. Keanu stood nearby, quietly talking with the lighting team. When they finished, he walked over to her. You handled today well, he said. She smiled a little. I didn't handle it. It handled me. He laughed softly, that calm, low laugh that carried warmth. That's how truth works. She looked at him for a moment. Why did you keep that note on the piano? He hesitated for a second, then said, because some things are better said without speaking. I thought maybe you'd find it when you were ready. She nodded, feeling her throat tight. Thank you. You don't have to thank me, he said. You earned your peace. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. It was not romantic. It was deeper, a recognition between two souls who had walked through fire and come out gentle. The next day would bring more filming, more long hours, and another emotional scene. But for tonight, as Sandra stepped out of the studio into the cool evening air, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. She looked back once more through the glass window. Keanu was still inside, helping the crew move a heavy prop, treating everyone with the same quiet respect. And for the first time since she left all those years ago, Sandra smiled without fear. The next few days passed quietly, but something had changed between Sandra and Keanu. It was not loud or visible, but everyone on set could feel it. The air was lighter, the rehearsals smoother, and even the new actors seemed calmer when the two of them were around. Kindness had become the new rhythm of the studio. On the morning of the third week, Sandra arrived early again. She had begun to do that lately. There was comfort in the stillness of the empty studio before everyone arrived. The piano in the corner had become her favorite place. Sometimes she played soft melodies while waiting, not because she was good at it, but because the sound helped her think. Keanu entered a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one near her without saying a word. She smiled gently. You're early again, she said. He sat down on the stool beside her. You too. For a moment they sat in silence, the soft light brushing across the stage. Do you ever think, Sandra began slowly, that some people are meant to cross paths again just to finish what was left undone? Keanu looked at her thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe kindness finds its way back when it feels safe again. His words lingered in the air. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the piano and began to play a few quiet notes, almost absent-mindedly. Keanu listened. The melody was uneven, fragile, but sincere, like a memory trying to find its place. Then Martin entered with his clipboard and a big smile. Morning, you two. Today's scene is the big one. It's the emotional reveal. Are you ready? Sandra exhaled slowly. As ready as I can be. Martin looked pleased. Good, this one's important. It'll be the turning point of the film. Keanu glanced at her, giving a small nod. We've been waiting for this part. The setup began. The set had been transformed into a quiet living room scene. Warm light poured through fake windows, and a soft breeze from hidden fans made the curtains move gently. The mood was peaceful, but beneath it was a storm of emotion. Sandra was supposed to confront her character's guilt in this scene. She would confess to something that had been misunderstood. The lines were simple, but the emotions were complex. As the camera rolled, Sandra took a deep breath. She looked at Keanu, who played the one person willing to listen. I tried to fix it, she said softly. He answered, You don't have to explain. Her voice shook slightly. But if I don't, you'll never understand. I already do, he said. She looked away, eyes glistening. You think you do, but you don't know what it's like to live with it. Then tell me, he replied calmly, and she did. But this time she wasn't acting. Her emotions broke through the barrier between fiction and truth. I stayed because someone needed me, she said, her voice trembling. And when it all fell apart, I thought it was my fault. I thought if I disappeared, everything would heal. Keanu's expression softened with real pain. And did it? Her eyes filled with tears. No, it only broke me more. The words weren't in the script, but no one dared to stop her. Keanu took a step closer. Then stop disappearing, he said gently. It's time people see who you really are. The cameras kept rolling. Martin's eyes widened as he realized he was witnessing something rare, two people healing in front of everyone, using the story as their language. The moment was so raw that when Martin finally whispered, "Cut!" the crew stayed frozen for several seconds before breaking into quiet applause. Sandra turned away, wiping her eyes quickly. She wasn't embarrassed. She was exhausted, emotionally and spiritually, but in a strangely peaceful way. Keanu handed her a tissue, smiling softly. "You always give more than the script asks for." She smiled back faintly. "Maybe I just have more to say than I thought." Martin walked over, still moved. "That scene was perfect. We'll keep every frame of it. You both just gave life to this film." After the shoot, the studio emptied slowly. Sandra stayed behind again, this time sitting near the piano, lost in thought. Keanu eventually returned, his jacket slung over one shoulder. "Still here?" She nodded. "I like this time of day. Everything feels real when it's quiet." He sat beside her. "Quiet has always been my favorite sound." They shared a small laugh. Then Sandra looked at him seriously. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you ever tell anyone what really happened that day?" He paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Because I thought you didn't want anyone to know. I saw how you carried it. I thought silence was your choice." She frowned slightly. "It wasn't, it was fear." "Fear of what?" "Of being misunderstood again," she said. "Of losing respect. Of people thinking I was weak." Keanu nodded slowly. "You were never weak, you just chose peace over defense. That's strength most people never learn." Her eyes softened. "You really believe that?" He smiled gently. "I wouldn't have waited this long if I didn't." That sentence hung in the air like a quiet confession. It wasn't romantic, yet it carried deep emotion. She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. After a moment, she whispered, "Thank you." Keanu stood and walked toward the door, stopping only once. "We all break in silence sometimes, but not everyone learns how to rebuild quietly." "You did." He left her there, speechless, with those words echoing in her mind. She looked around the empty studio, the place that once carried so much pain. Now it felt different, lighter, alive again. She sat at the piano and began playing softly, repeating the same gentle tune she had practiced that morning. But this time, it didn't sound sad. It sounded like hope returning. As she played, she noticed something small on the floor near her feet, another folded paper. She picked it up, her heart beating faster. Inside, in the same careful handwriting as before, were the words, "Forgiveness begins when truth feels safe again." She smiled faintly, pressing the note to her chest. Outside, through the large glass window, she could see Keanu talking to Martin near the cars, his calm figure outlined against the setting sun. For the first time in a long time, Sandra didn't feel like a stranger to her own story. She finally felt seen, understood, and free. The next morning, rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the studio. The light was dim, the sky gray, and yet there was a quiet warmth inside the building. The sound of rain mixed with the faint hum of the film lights gave the place a strange sense of peace. Sandra arrived holding a cup of tea, her hair slightly damp from the walk. She had barely stepped inside when she noticed Keanu already there, helping one of the crew members fix a broken cable near the stage. He looked up when she entered, smiled lightly, and nodded. "You made it through the rain." She smiled back. "Barely. I think the weather is testing my patience." "Patience passes every test if you give it enough time," he said calmly, still adjusting the cable. She laughed softly. "That sounds like something only you would say." He shrugged, his calmness never leaving him. "Maybe, or maybe it's something you already know." The day's scene was an important one. The characters were supposed to face a situation where one had to choose honesty over pride. Martin explained it carefully, but everyone could sense that the emotion behind it went deeper than fiction. The story they were telling on screen was starting to mirror the truth between them. When the cameras began to roll, Sandra and Keanu stood facing each other under the soft light. "You think forgiveness is easy," she said, following the script. "No," he replied gently, "but it's the only way to stay human." She hesitated, her voice trembling. "And if forgiveness means losing the people you tried to protect, then maybe they were never lost," he said. "Maybe they were waiting for you to forgive yourself first." The words weren't written in the script. They came from him, pure and real. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. Something in her heart broke open, not painfully, but like a wound finally being cleaned. She could barely hold her composure, but she didn't stop acting. She let the emotion flow, raw and honest. When the director whispered "cut," the silence that followed was full of emotion. No one moved for several seconds. Even the assistants who usually rushed to adjust lighting stood frozen, touched by what they had just seen. Martin approached them quietly. "You two have turned this film into something else entirely," he said in a low voice. "It's not just art anymore, it's truth." Sandra smiled faintly through her tears. Truth has a way of finding its stage. As everyone took a short break, Sandra walked to the side of the room, needing a moment alone. She leaned against the wall, watching the rain pour down outside. It reminded her of the day she had left the old film set years ago, the same kind of rain, the same heavy clouds, but her heart was different now. Back then she left broken, now she stayed to heal. She felt a presence beside her and turned slightly. Keanu had joined her, holding 2 paper cups of warm tea. He handed her one silently. "You looked like you needed this," he said. "You read minds now?" she asked, smiling softly. "Only yours," he said with quiet humor. They both laughed, a soft, shared laugh that dissolved the heaviness in the air. For a few moments they just stood there, watching the rain. Neither spoke. There was no need to. Sometimes silence speaks more clearly than words. Then Sandra spoke, her voice thoughtful. "I found another note yesterday." Keanu's eyes met hers, but he didn't react. "What did it say?" "It said forgiveness begins when truth feels safe again." He smiled slightly, his calm expression giving nothing away. "And did it feel safe?" She nodded. "For the first time in years, yes." He didn't answer, but the warmth in his eyes said enough. That night after the shoot, the crew gathered to review footage. The room was dark except for the glow of the projector. Scenes of the two of them played on the wall, their expressions real, their voices trembling with emotion. As the film replayed the moment Keanu whispered her name for the first time, Sandra felt chills. The sound carried something pure, something timeless. The crew clapped softly when the footage ended. Martin turned to them, his voice filled with quiet pride. "This isn't just acting," he said. "This is healing on screen." Later, as everyone began to leave, Sandra stayed behind again. She stood near the piano, tracing her fingers over its keys. It had become a silent witness to everything, their silence, their confessions, their peace. She pressed one key gently, and the soft note echoed across the room. Keanu, who had stayed back as well, looked up from his script. "Still awake?" he asked. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how strange it is that pain and peace can exist in the same room." He nodded slowly. "That's what makes people human." She looked at him carefully. "You always talk like someone who's already made peace with everything." "Not everything," he said. "But I've learned that kindness is the only thing that never loses its value." She smiled faintly. "That's why people respect you, you know?" He shook his head. "Respect is not something people owe, it's something you earn by giving it first." Those words settled deep in her heart. They were so simple, yet they held the kind of wisdom that takes a lifetime to learn. Before leaving, she walked toward the piano again and noticed something under its lid, another folded note. Her heart skipped. She opened it carefully, recognizing the same handwriting. It said, "When kindness stays silent, it still changes everything." She looked up at Keanu, who was quietly gathering his things, pretending not to notice her reaction. But she knew. This was his way of speaking, through silence, through small gestures, through unseen kindness. As she left the studio, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, the streetlights glowing gently on the wet ground. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter, as if the past had finally begun to loosen its hold. That night she wrote something in her own handwriting for the first time in years, not for a script, not for anyone else, but for herself. She wrote, "Healing is not loud. Sometimes it whispers your name when the world is quiet." And when she put down her pen, she smiled softly, knowing that the story, both the film and her life, had begun to find its true meaning. The next day began brighter than usual. Sunlight poured through the tall studio windows, chasing away the gray mood that had lingered during the rain. Everyone seemed lighter, more at ease, as if something unseen had settled quietly inside their hearts. Sandra arrived holding her script and a calm smile. She had slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The guilt that used to wake her in the middle of the night had softened into acceptance. She walked straight toward the piano, gently touched its wooden edge, and smiled. Keanu was already there, standing beside the director, discussing the final sequence of the film. When he saw her, he nodded with his usual quiet grace. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. Today's scene was short but powerful. It was the final act, a moment of truth and closure. Their characters would say goodbye, not out of anger, but out of peace. As the lights dimmed, Keanu stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Sometimes we carry pain because we believe we deserve it." Sandra looked at him, emotion rising in her chest. "And what if we don't? Then we let it go." he said gently. Not because it didn't matter, but because we finally understand. His eyes met hers, and she felt that same whispering silence between them again, the one that carried more meaning than words ever could. She took a slow breath. Thank you for waiting for me to understand. Keanu's lips curved slightly. Thank you for coming back. It wasn't just dialogue, it was real. Martin quietly whispered, cut, but no one moved. The moment felt sacred. The scene didn't need retakes. It was perfect as it was. Afterward, the crew gathered around them with quiet respect. Martin wiped his eyes, saying softly, this film isn't about fame or drama anymore. It's about forgiveness. Sandra smiled faintly. And about kindness that never needs applause. As the day ended, Keanu walked her to the door. Outside, the golden sunset painted the world in warmth. Do you still keep the notes? He asked softly. Yes, she said, smiling. Every one of them. Good, he replied. Then you already know the last one. She tilted her head. And what's that? He looked at her gently. When you forgive yourself, the world forgives you too. Her eyes softened and she whispered, Thank you, Keanu. He smiled with quiet kindness. You don't have to thank me, Sandra. You just had to remember who you are. And with that, he turned to leave, his calm steps echoing softly down the hallway. Sandra stood there for a long moment, holding the memory of his words like light in her hands. Ending line. Part 5. The morning sun returned, bright and calm after days of rain. The studio glowed softly as the crew prepared for what everyone knew would be the last big scene. It was quiet, peaceful, almost sacred. Sandra walked in with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't hiding anymore. She carried her script, but she no longer needed to read from it. Her eyes searched the room until she found Keanu standing near the light rig, helping a young assistant set up safely, the same place where everything once went wrong. The sight made her heart ache and heal at the same time. When the set was ready, Martin spoke quietly. This is it. No retakes, no rehearsals, just honesty. As the cameras rolled, Keanu looked at her with the same quiet warmth he had shown since the day she returned. We cannot change the past, he said gently, following the script but meaning every word. Sandra replied softly, but we can choose how it lives inside us. The studio was nearly empty now. The final scene had been filmed, the lights dimmed, and the crew had started packing everything away. Only a soft echo of the last dialogue lingered in the air. Sandra sat quietly on the edge of the stage, looking at the piano that had witnessed everything, her fear, her healing, her rediscovery of peace. The day's shoot had gone perfectly. Martin had called it the most genuine ending he had ever seen. The story of two souls forgiving themselves had ended with silence, not applause. It was a silence that meant completion. Sandra exhaled deeply. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She looked around the room, remembering the moment she had walked in weeks ago and heard Keanu whisper her name. That single whisper had started everything, a whisper that carried truth, respect, and the courage to forgive. She stood slowly, ready to leave, when she noticed Keanu standing by the window, looking out at the fading sunset. The golden light painted his calm face with warmth. She walked toward him quietly. It feels strange, she said softly. After all this time, it's really over. He turned and smiled faintly. Some stories end when they're told, others end when they're understood. She looked down, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for helping me understand. He shook his head gently. You helped yourself. I only reminded you who you were before the world made you doubt it. They stood there for a moment, neither speaking. The light outside began to fade into evening, and the quiet of the studio grew deeper. Then Sandra spoke again, her tone full of gratitude. I kept all your notes. He smiled softly. Then you'll want the last one. She tilted her head, curious. There's another one. He nodded toward the piano. Check under the lid. Sandra walked over, her fingers trembling as she lifted the wooden lid one last time. A single folded paper rested there, small and simple. She opened it slowly and read the words aloud under her breath. Respect means seeing someone for who they are, even when the world looks away. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked at him across the room, her voice soft but steady. You wrote that for me? He nodded. No, he said quietly. I wrote it for both of us. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the emotion wash through her. When she looked back up, Keanu had walked closer. There was kindness in his eyes, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. You know, she said, smiling through her tears, people will never know what really happened between us, what these scenes truly meant. They don't need to, he replied. They'll feel it, that's enough. His calmness wrapped around her like a quiet promise. The respect in his eyes was so genuine that it felt like light itself. She stepped closer, speaking softly. You never raised your voice, you never blamed, and yet you changed everything. He smiled faintly. Sometimes all it takes is a whisper. That line made her laugh gently, her tears still shining. Like the first day, she said, when I walked in and you said my name. And you finally heard it, he replied. Outside, the last light of the day faded, leaving only the soft glow of the studio lamps. They stood there for a while, surrounded by quiet, letting the peace of the moment sink in. Then Keanu extended his hand slowly. Walk with me? She nodded and took it without hesitation. Together they walked out of the room, the same room that had once been full of judgment and pain, now filled only with kindness and respect. As they reached the door, Sandra looked back one last time. The piano stood silently in the golden haze, the last note still echoing in her heart. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Some endings don't fade, they stay kind." Keanu heard her and smiled gently. And that's what makes them eternal. They stepped out into the evening light together, not as two actors finishing a film, but as two souls who had rediscovered what it truly meant to be seen, understood, and respected. The door closed behind them, and for the first time in years, Sandra didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was finally going home.